Boldwood presents Queen Bee, written by Nina Manning and read by Emma Powell and Jerry Allan. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood.
Chapter 1, 10th of May 2019, 8:15 a.m, Gloucester Police Station. Interview with Natasha Redwood, Deputy Head of Helesbury Primary School. I had my suspicions from the start. In my job, I interact with hundreds of people every day, you see. Something never sat quite right with me, but I couldn't ever put my finger on it. It was a gut instinct. You know that feeling? There was this void opening up between Evie and Miranda when they had previously been best friends, inseparable, for over a year. Then along comes Verity, and suddenly Evie is a different person. So yes, if you're asking if there were any clues, then yes, of course, in hindsight. Oh, the joy of hindsight. I can look back now and realise that everything that didn't add up at the time, that I pushed aside, were glaringly obvious clues. I should have said something sooner. Maybe then things would have ended differently. But you don't, do you? You ignore the clues. You always ignore them, even when they're screaming you in the face. Chapter 2, Before. The woman walked along the beach, the wind whipping her hair across her face. She hadn't wanted to come out that morning, but when Bernie, her 8-year-old West Highland Terrier, had come and sat next to her feet, looking up at her with his little watery eyes, she couldn't bear it any longer. Once in the bracing air, she hadn't felt glad that she was out in the way that people often did. She thought only of the cosy warm embers of the fire, lingering in the hearth, and the tin of cookies she had baked with the grandchildren 2 days before, now perfectly chewy and begging to be dipped into a cup of hot chocolate. But she kept pushing forward, hat pulled firmly over her ears, scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, and hands stuffed firmly in her pockets. She watched as Bernie raced ahead, sniffing in between the small wooden boats moored away on the shore near the brambles. She never understood who owned these boats. Most of them looked so old and decrepit. The row of boats came to an end, and then a strip of brightly coloured beach huts came into view. The woman had been intending to turn around and head back to the main path that would lead her back home to the warm fire and chocolate, but Bernie had scampered off ahead and was already at the second beach hut, sniffing and cocking his leg. The huts ran for another 100 yards or so. Only a little further. She would turn around at the end of them and head home. She trudged reluctantly towards Bernie, who had now thankfully stopped, giving her time to catch up with him, the wind coaxing her along from behind this time. Bernie was sniffing near one particular beach hut, and so the woman presumed he would take another pee and move on. But he jumped up onto the small wooden veranda, his ears pricked up, as though he were now waiting for someone to walk right out. The woman arrived next to him and noticed that this hut was one of the shabbier ones on the block. The paint had probably been a bright, bold blue once, but had now been bleached in insipid turquoise and was peeling off in strips, revealing the austere wood behind it. It was mid-January, and none of the huts along this stretch would open until at least mid-March, when the owners began getting them back into shape again for the spring and summer season. But something about this particular hut had enticed Bernie over. He wasn't any kind of working hunting dog, but occasionally something would grab his attention. The woman stopped next to Bernie as he cocked his head from side to side, the way he would when someone was talking to him in that high-pitched way people sometimes spoke to animals. "What is it then, boy?" The woman's breath was a little short and ragged from her exertion in the winter elements. She stuffed her hands further into her pockets. The bitter, unrelenting wind thrust itself at her back, and she stumbled forward, taking the 4 steps to join Bernie on the veranda, who was in no hurry to move. These beach huts were worth a few quid more than the ones down at the tourist beach. People paid for the luxury to be off the beaten track and away from the masses, not forgetting the extra 12 square foot and extra large window they got for their pound. The front of the beach hut was a glass bifolding door with a net curtain running across it. perhaps to reduce some of the light bleaching the interiors, but more likely to stop passers-by stopping and staring in. "Come on now, Bernie, whatever is it?" The woman crouched at her dog's side. He cocked his head once more, left then right, as though he were following a conversation at a frequency beyond his mistress's hearing. "We really need to be getting back now." She patted his head and thought of the last log she had put on the fire before she left the house. It would be burnt down by now. She braced herself to stand. She wasn't putting up with this nonsense any more. But as she went to turn, she saw a flicker of something move in the corner of the window at the same time as Bernie let out a little bark. She stayed looking at the front of the beach hut. The bifolding doors were on a latch, but there was no lock. This time, she dropped again to her knees. Then, just as though she had summoned it, the net curtain twitched. Then it moved a centimetre, and then a small hand pulled the curtain to one side, revealing the face of a child, pale-faced, perhaps 5 or 6 years old. Their hair was cut jaggedly short, so that it was impossible to tell if they were a boy or a girl. The woman gasped, stood and staggered backwards. "Is your mummy or daddy there?" the woman said loudly to the window, looking around the empty beach for a sign of anyone who could claim this child as theirs. The child shook their head. "Are you all alone?" The woman tried again. The child nodded. The woman grappled in her pocket for her phone, and without hesitation dialed 999.
Chapter 3. Dinner at mine, 7:30? Kiss? I pressed send on the text and waited for the reply. Annabelle was eating her spaghetti and David was still at work. I had little else on that day, so I had time to wait for the reply to come back from Evie. We had made a loose arrangement to see one another that evening. I'd been having trouble finalising the specs on the recent set of candles I had created, and Evie was so good for bouncing ideas off. She was a busy mum, like we all were, but she always found time for me. Like, always. In the year since we'd met, I could count on one finger the number of times Evie had ever cancelled, and that had been with good reason. Her daughter Juno had been throwing up all day. At 43, I finally felt like I was in a proper friendship, as sad as that may seem. The time and effort I'd poured into female relationships in the past, only for them to turn out to be merely masquerading as friendships, was thankfully a distant memory. Pity I'd had to wait until it all blew up in my face before I discovered that. But that was then. This was a new life. This was what real companionship felt like, not one based on superficial hugs and praise. The last year has been a new beginning for me, and I wanted to celebrate one whole year living in the tiny village of Helesbury. And who better to do that with than my best friend, Evie? I had never before referred to a grown woman as my best friend. It had always felt a little childish. Adults didn't parade around announcing to the world they were best friends. But I knew Evie felt the same way as me. We were both incredibly grateful to have one another. Evie's reply came through just as my daughter, Annabelle, sucked up her last piece of spaghetti. "Perfect, Miranda. Looking forward to it. Kiss." I felt my heart swell with happiness. "Well done, sweetheart," I said to Annabelle as she took her empty plate to the dishwasher. Annabelle had always been a good eater. From the day she'd taken her first bite of solid food just over 8 years ago, I had known she was going to be one of those kids who didn't make a fuss with her food. And I'm not ashamed to admit there had been jealousy from other mothers who struggled to get anything remotely healthy inside their kids, whereas Annabelle was wolfing down every fruit and veg available. I remained modest, though, and tried to share any tips when asked how the hell I got a 1-year-old to eat quinoa and edamame beans. But the truth was, I was just lucky. Lucky to have met and married David just over 10 years ago, and lucky to have our one and only daughter. 3 was the magic number as far as I was concerned. I turned out the light in Annabelle's room and blew her a final kiss just before 7:30, and then heard the familiar light knock on the front door. I arrived downstairs moments later and looked at my beautiful friend, her cheeks flushed from the walk over here in the late March wind. She pulled off her beanie hat and her bobbed blonde hair was ruffled, yet she still managed to look chic. We greeted one another with our usual kiss and a hug. She smelt faintly of vanilla or coconut, I was never sure which, and I never asked her what product it was, as though asking may suddenly alter its presence in some way. She unswaddled herself from her oversized scarf and draped it over the banister. "I'm so desperate for summer now." Evie laughed in that hoarse, throaty way she always did, which I found so endearing. "I'm so sick of these layers." I chastised David for leaving his coat flung on the banister every day when he arrived home from work, but Evie doing it felt comforting, like she was familiar enough with me and being in my home to leave her belongings where they found themselves. We walked through into the kitchen. "Well, I've created a little piece of the Mediterranean here tonight, a little prelude to the summer months to come." I held my arms out to emphasize my efforts. "Oh, wow!" Evie gushed at the array of colours and textures laid out on the table. Chorizo, artichoke, yellow peppers, and sun-dried tomato hummus. "This is so beautiful, thank you." She handed me a bottle of wine, still chilled, and I took down 2 glasses from the cupboard. "No, Evie, thank you." I popped the cork and poured. "You've been such a great friend to me this last year. I don't think I would have managed it without you." "Oh, you would have." Evie took a glass and we clinked them together lightly. "You're a very strong person, very inspiring too." She looked at me knowingly and I felt a flutter in my stomach. Strong was not how some would have described me before I moved here. But no one knew that side of me in Helesbury. Here I was someone Evie looked up to. I couldn't quite believe how lucky I had been, and I knew that it had to be luck. We live in a world where anyone could find anything out about anyone at a touch of a few buttons. And yet here I was, enjoying an almost entirely new life in the countryside, no one any wiser to my past. It felt like I had been reborn, as though I'd been given a fresh chance with a new friend, and this time I was going to hold on to her. "You've achieved so much in such a short space of time," Evie continued with her praise. "The move, getting Annabelle settled, getting your business going. I mean, you launched the first village book club, which was exactly what was needed here, by the way. I would have done it myself a long time ago, but I've been far too busy. Everyone loves you even more now. You're quite the queen bee. And I mean that in a good way. Every tribe needs its queen." I felt my cheeks redden. She was only being nice and trying to flatter me. But the truth was, I had realised the moment that I moved here that Evie was the most popular woman in the village, adored by all. Had I really taken her spot in such a short space of time? I had certainly no intention of moving into Evie's spot. In my eyes, she was still the most adored woman in the village. "I'm really looking forward to book club this week," I smiled. "I've got so many suggestions for titles for the next few months." "Of course you do, and you always give great recommendations. I'm really looking forward to Thursday too." Evie's phone pinged from the table where she'd put it when she walked in. She picked it up and swiped the screen to open it as she continued. "Honestly, an absolute breath of fresh air. As I said, exactly what..." Evie was looking at her phone as her voice trailed away. "Well, don't stop praising me now. I was just getting used to the compliments." I laughed, but stopped abruptly when I could see Evie wasn't laughing. "Evie?" Evie glanced up, but she was looking straight through me. "Is everything okay?" I asked. She shook her head as though dragging herself from a daydream. "Yes, all absolutely fine. A client I've neglected, that's all." She shoved her phone into her handbag. I quickly searched Evie's face for the truth I was sure she was trying to hide from me. What had she seen that had caused that glimmer of concern? And more importantly, should I be worried? These days, a world of information was at your fingertips through a smartphone. Had Evie seen something? Something about me? "Anyway, here's to wonderful you and this gorgeous house, and to 1 year in Helesbury." I was thrust back into the moment by Evie's usual optimism. She held her glass out again, and I clinked it and felt the warmth in her voice. "Cheers," we both said in unison. As I sipped the cool drink, I allowed myself to feel that I deserved this happiness. The past was in the past. I was here with my fabulous new friend, reveling in my new life. Things could only get better. Chapter 4. I was late for book club, which this evening was being hosted by the lovely Hattie. But I would not allow the lateness to absorb me. Back in London, no one would have batted an eyelid if I turned up half an hour or even an hour late. Things seemed to get going a lot later there. Whereas here, it was just going to be me and 5 other women in a kitchen in a small village on the edge of the Cotswolds. I couldn't just slip in unnoticed. It wasn't our first meeting, but I still felt I needed to make a good impression. I felt as though I was on probation. One slip up and things could come crashing down on me again. It terrified me because I knew how easily it could happen. David had had to drag me to Helesbury kicking and screaming, but now he'd have a hard time getting me to leave. I'd settled in much quicker than anticipated, as though it was always meant to be. Especially when I met my Evie. My sweet Evie. We'd met at the school gates, our daughters, both aged 8, going on 18, in the same class. Evie hadn't been living here for long when I arrived, but she'd already secured her popular and well-respected status. She made me realise what friends were again. Hattie had 3 boys at the local primary whom she was raising with impeccable manners, but she was also on the PTA, volunteered once a week for the Samaritans, and ran a small online hamper business. The woman was a legend. Except when it was her turn to choose books for the book club, but the less said about that, the better. Hattie and her husband lived in the old post office, the actual post office having been incorporated into the local shop. It was a mere 4-minute walk from my house, so I got to wear heels and feel a little bit glam, because that's how I like to feel. I still like to feel I had it, whatever it is. After I had Annabelle, I lost all my confidence. And just as I was starting to feel more like my old self, everything fell apart and I was right back down there again. No confidence, no friends, all my own doing. And I was still repenting for those mistakes. Being late would make me look bad, I knew it would, and the thought of people thinking badly of me made my hands go damp and my heart pound. I tried some deep breaths to calm myself down, but they didn't work, and I could feel the panic increasing even more. I'd managed to get booked in for a last-minute hair appointment to the hairdressers in Gloucester, and even though I knew it meant I might possibly be late, I wanted to enjoy that salon-fresh feeling. The stylist had done a great job, though, and my dark hair was now perfectly blow-dried and set into big, beautiful curls. I knew everyone would comment, and I'd be centre stage for a few moments. I occasionally missed the glamour of my life when we lived in Chelsea, and a new cut reminded me that I could look my best, but I didn't need to fall victim to that lifestyle, the one that had brought me here in the first place. As my heels clicked along the road, I thought about the other women who would be there this evening. Olivia, the manager of the local library, a giant of a woman in her 50s with grey bobbed hair, whom you wouldn't wish to cross on a dark night, huge hands, just like a man, yet painted so delicately with red varnish. Then there's Natasha, or Tash to all her friends, who was the deputy head teacher at the primary school. Small and mouse-like, wouldn't say boo to a goose until she had to tell 36 7-year-olds to sit the hell down. Then Beth, sweet little Beth, 23, a student finishing her degree yet still living at home with her parents. I was very proud of our little club. We were women of different ages and from different backgrounds coming together over a common love. Of course, Evie and I saw each other outside of the club too, and quite regularly. We were forever popping in and out at one another's houses at the weekend. She had truly shown me what it meant to trust someone, and it had taken me a lot to trust people again. I tried to walk as I would if I were on a busy London road, but the heels were not meant for rough, bumpy paths. I clip-clopped past the church and the village hall and then past the pub as people were beginning to dribble in for their prelude to the weekend. A few more months and we could sit in our gardens with Pims in the evenings. I knew everyone would be there at Hattie's already, because it really is the highlight of the month, and I felt a swell of pride that it was me who had brought this ray of sunshine into their lives, I mean, what were these women doing before I came along? I laughed with David sometimes. Then I would catch myself. I wasn't that shallow person anymore. I had changed. I had been determined I would cement relationships that meant something, that weren't just for show. I arrived at Hattie's and went to the back door, as she instructs everyone to do. She has a more relaxed attitude towards visitors than me. I prefer everyone to come through the front. I didn't spend £8,000 on the decoration in the hallway for people to trip over riding boots and for the scent of musty leather to get stuck in their nostrils as they trudge their way inside. I know I'm trying my best to fit in, but I have certain standards I simply won't let slip. As I opened the back door, I was welcomed by the raucous noise of ladies who have had a week of responsibilities and are now ready to let them fall by the wayside. Again, I felt a swell of pride. I brought us all together. As Evie told me, I was the queen bee. But I wonder if the others saw me that way too. "Hello?" I called as I stepped over an array of school bags, shoes, and what looked like a papier-mâché lobster. I didn't get a response and instead heard a loud roar of laughter echo through from the kitchen. It jolted my body. Then a ripple of annoyance ran through me. My arrival has not been heard or noticed. The annoyance grew stronger still as I almost tripped over a small plastic toy truck as I tottered down the hallway towards what Hattie referred to as the hub of the house. I was annoyed that I was late for my own book club because it sounded as if everyone was already having a great time without me. Hattie's kitchen had a certain cosy country cottage feel about it, which, despite the mess, was always warm and welcoming. It boasted a huge red Aga against the far wall. Old white and red tiles surrounded it. There was a huge white ceramic Belfast sink to the left and a large oak table in the centre with 8 or 9 chairs around it. Drawings, bills and other papers were piled high and pushed right to the edge of the table so they teetered precariously to make room for 6 place settings. I stood in the doorway and took everyone in. Beth and Tash were already seated, each with a glass of wine in hand, and Evie and Hattie were standing at the Aga. But it was the presence of another woman who clearly wasn't Olivia, laughing with Evie and Hattie, glass of wine in hand, that surprised me. The laugh, which, even as I came in through the back door, I knew I did not recognise. It sounded alien, hollow. My body tightened up. I stood in the doorway, the bottle of Chardonnay I had brought dripping condensation down my wrist and under the gold bracelet that David had given me for our wedding anniversary last month, and took her in. This woman, this stranger. She was unassuming, not the sort of person I would find myself drawn to or even raise my head towards if she passed me by. But somehow, there in that vast kitchen, I felt a presence about her that I couldn't put my finger on. She was a slight woman with mousy brown shoulder-length hair cut straight at the bottom. It was sleek and straight, but naturally so. She was wearing a brown V-neck sweater and blue skinny jeans, and she was leaning in towards Evie, my Evie, who was laughing at something she had just said. Then she glanced up at me and nudged Evie. "Miranda," Evie said, looking up. Was it my imagination, or was there a flicker of guilt across Evie's face, as though she were a small child caught with her hand in the sweetie cupboard? I smiled my best smile, but it felt awkward and forced. The other women all looked up, and a ripple of hellos sounded around the room. But the atmosphere felt thick and heavy, weighted with the presence of this new person, and the entrance that would normally have seen everyone greeting me with compliments on my hair, which was the one I'd been hoping for, was not to be. "Here she is," Hattie says blithely, turning from the Aga where there was a pot of something bubbling away. She wiped her hands on her apron, her cheeks pink from the heat of the kitchen and her red curly hair damp around her temple. I walked round and gave Hattie a light air kiss as the others fell into conversation. "Lovely to see you, Hats. This all smells absolutely delicious." I slid out of my heavy woolen jacket and placed it over the back of a chair just out of the way in the corner of the kitchen where it wouldn't get splashed with grease. "Wow, look at you," Hattie said, loud enough for everyone to turn towards me. You put us all to shame. Look at your hair, it's so clean and bouncy. There were nods of approval and a big smile from Evie. That's gorgeous, Miranda, she said, and I felt some comfort from the acknowledgement of my efforts. Evie stepped towards me and we embraced. My back was up. I knew I was stiff as I held her in my arms, and an act that would usually last several seconds was over before it had begun. I pulled my lips together and widened my eyes, ready for the introduction I sensed was coming. Miranda, can I introduce you to Verity? I inched forward and put my hand out. Verity reciprocated, placing a small, soft hand in mine. Hi. She struggled to retain eye contact and stepped back towards the warmth and security of Evie's side too quickly. Hello? I took a sidestep and handed the bottle of wine to Hattie, who took it with her usual flourish of gratitude. Pour me a large one, Hats, I said, and winked at her. She sniggered and pulled out a large wineglass from a cupboard next to the Aga. So, how on earth have you found yourself in this kitchen in a tiny village on the edge of Gloucestershire on a Thursday evening, Verity? I asked as I turned back to face them. Verity has just moved here, Evie offered. Wonderful, I said, hoping some sincerity had found its way to my voice. But I felt cheated, hurt. I knew it was churlish, but because I'd founded the book club, I felt some ownership over the members. Why hadn't Evie mentioned there was someone new coming tonight? She was supposed to be my best friend, wasn't she? We were only just discussing book club the other day. Surely the mention of a new guest to the club I had launched would have found its way into the conversation. I was stunned, but I tried to act anything other than that. Yes, she just moved this week, Evie continued. Fabulous. I looked blankly at Evie and then moved my eyes to Verity, hoping I would get some response from her, as it felt as though Evie was speaking nervously on her behalf, almost as though she felt guilty for bringing someone new tonight without even mentioning it to me. Which she should be, I thought. The book club didn't need more members. I began to feel a slight panic rise within me, a fight-or-flight instinct. I had begun to feel safe amongst these women, here with a little empire that I myself had built, and now suddenly it was all thrown off kilter. Perhaps I was overreacting, and later on, when I would be lying in my huge, super king-sized bed, David sat down in the study working until midnight as he did every Thursday, I would regret the way I had handled this first-time interaction with Verity, a friend of a friend. But for now, I couldn't stop the feeling of betrayal that was flooding my body. I leant over and took the bottle of Chardonnay from the kitchen side, where Hattie had left it far too close to the Aga without a scrap of a wine cooler in sight, and topped up Verity's empty glass. Better drink it whilst it's cold. I hoped this gesture would make up for my inability to embrace the situation. Verity held her glass out, and I filled it almost to the top. Hattie was a lovely host, but she lacked the details, like wine coolers, napkin rings, the sort of stuff that was second nature to me. David called me the hostess with the mostess, and it was true. I enjoyed looking after people. When I was a child, my parents had entertained almost every weekend. I had watched how my mother lay the table, slowly and meticulously, followed her around the kitchen as she prepped hors d'oeuvres and stirred martinis. Then she would slip out of her apron, give her hair a quick fix, and greet their guests. I would sit on the corner step on the staircase, just hidden by the banister, and peek out at the most perfect view of the dining room and the hallway. Occasionally, my mother would click-clop back through into the kitchen to bring through more wine. I was convinced I was stealthy enough not to be spotted, but when I was older, she told me she knew I was there, but she'd never minded. The most important thing I had learnt from my mother was how to play the gracious host, even when the guests were less than amiable, or when you absolutely would rather do anything but. It was exhausting, always putting on a face, pretending to others that all was well when, on the inside, it often wasn't. But it was innate. It was something I simply had to do. I had seen how my mother and father hosted as a way to assure others of their happiness and stability. and I had carried on the tradition. It had been such a relief not to have had to appease anyone after we moved. All those pent-up emotions trying to burst at the seam whilst I socialised with a smile plastered across my face hadn't been felt for over 12 months. But here I was, those same fears, emotions resurrected as I stood next to Verity. I'd felt so comfortable with Hattie, Evie, Beth, Tash and Olivia. Now it all felt wrong and fake again. I raised my glass to the newcomer. Cheers to you, Verity. It's lovely to see a new fresh face in the village. I lied. Are you here for work or pleasure? I watched as Evie's mouth opened to speak, and I felt another jolt of annoyance. Was she really going to speak for Verity again? I edged myself closer to Verity, blocking Evie out of my side view. I am writing a book. I'll be staying for a while. Verity spoke softly. I could hear a myriad of tones in her accent, but couldn't place where she was from. Oh, wow, so you're a writer. How fabulous. A writer in the village. I looked around at Hattie and Evie. I know, isn't that exciting? Hattie said. I told her she'll have to do a little talk in the village hall. I felt heat rising through my body at the prospect of this stranger holding the spotlight, taking it away from me. Not that I had anything to offer that was grander, but it felt as though there was suddenly a sense of competition, that I would need to up my game. What had Evie called me? The Queen Bee. To think I had laughed it off at the time. Perhaps I needed to assert myself in that role. I took a long gulp of my wine. So, what sort of book are you writing? My voice was high and stretched. Historical fiction, Verity said delicately. How thrilling, I said, feigning a smile and interest. Historical fiction was not my idea of fun reading. I preferred a good thriller or rom-com. I don't suppose you've read So Lucky, have you? It's my book choice from last month. We're discussing it tonight. I don't get much time to read. Verity trailed off. She looked over at Evie as she was speaking. I followed her gaze. Evie's expression was taut. Which is why I'm here. No better way to expand one's reading horizon than by joining a book club. I looked between the two women. One I had known for just over a year, but I considered our friendship to be a pretty solid one. And one woman I had just met this evening whom I knew nothing about. I had so many questions for her. I had felt a distinct energy when I walked through the back door, and now my doubts were already being confirmed. There was a faltering in the way she had answered. I was adept at sensing these things with two socialites for parents and seeing so many parties, meeting so many artists and professors. I had observed how atmospheres changed and shifted when certain people spoke. How my mother would lift the back of her hand to her chin and brush it lightly when she felt uncomfortable at something someone was saying, or when a man moved too close to her and broke the boundaries, causing her to shift away. Always looking to my father, who was always caught up in deep conversation about his next big project. Then I would remember how I would go to my mother's bedside in the morning and be hit by a wall of stale alcohol. I would sit next to her and brush her hair as she lay in until midday. Those days had felt so glamorous to me as a child. But as I grew, I quickly saw beyond the theatre, and what lay beneath was as ugly as a bowl of bruised fruit. Since we'd met, I had seen so many wonderful qualities in Evie. But what was becoming abundantly clear to me now was that no matter how much I tried to trust people and let them into my life a little, they would always let me down. Well, it's a stonker of a book, and everyone here is going to absolutely rave about it, aren't you girls? I said to the room. There was a collective murmur. I tried to depict who of the four women had agreed with me. Well, I, for one, thought it was bloody brilliant, came the voice of Olivia from the doorway. She entered the room, kissed our host first, then came to me. Honestly, Miranda, it was hilarious. I nearly wet myself at one point, and my tittering aggravated Angus no end. Oh, hello, who's this? Olivia still acted as sprightly as a teenager and looked like one, this evening's outfit being pale blue denim jeans, Converse trainers and a rainbow t-shirt. Only her grey bobbed hair gave her age away. Olivia had, for a second, been my saviour, the way she'd shown such an interest in the book. But now she was just as intrigued with the mystery guest as I was. I moved round to the table in front of Beth and Tash and sat down opposite them. "You all right?" Tash asked casually. "Super." I felt my gut tighten as I spoke the word. "Annabelle loved your assembly on kindness the other day. She talked about it over dinner and again at bedtime." Moving the attention to Tash was the only way to distract myself from what was turning into an unexpected evening. "Oh, that's lovely to hear, Miranda." Tash smiled. The red wine had stained her teeth. I knew she found the job as deputy head stressful at times, and she had confessed to me back when we first met that red wine was her one vice. I tried to join in with their chat, but my gaze kept returning to Evie, and now Olivia standing at the Arga with Verity. Thoughts spiraled through my mind. Had I done the right thing by letting myself become close with another woman again? Was I setting myself up for another colossal failure? I wasn't sure my mind could take it if something went wrong, if I was forced into a situation to try and protect myself. The one thing I had promised myself was that I would not allow it to happen again.
Chapter 5. Before. The woman stepped back as the female police officer took the child, a girl, by the hand. The male police officer also moved away as the girl smiled, exited the hut, and seemed to welcome the embrace of a stranger. The policewoman thanked the woman and asked her name. "Diana. I live just on the other side of the cliffs. Do you think she's okay? Has she been abandoned?" "It's hard to tell," the policewoman said, "but she shouldn't be here all alone at her age, that's for sure. We'll take her to the station, get her a nice warm drink, and then social services will take it from there." "Oh," said Diana, "such a terrible shame. What kind of parents could leave a child locked in a beach hut?" The policewoman drew the child closer to her and placed a reassuring arm around her. "Who knows? There are all sorts out there. Some things you wouldn't even believe." Diana shuddered. "I'm sure. Thank you for calling us. Who knows what might have happened if you hadn't spotted her." "I have Bernie to thank. He sensed someone was in there." The policewoman bent down and patted the little terrier on the head. "What a clever dog." Yes, he is." Diana wasn't looking at Bernie, but at the child, who was staring at the beach hut. The police officer held her arm securely over the child's shoulder, the other hand stroking Bernie behind the ears. "Can you make sure you give your details to my colleague?" she said as she stood up again. "So if we need to contact you for anything, we can get in touch?" "I will, thank you." Diana took one more look at the child. The policeman, who'd been to their car, was back with a blanket, and it was now being wrapped around the child. With a final nod to Diana, the police officers began escorting the little girl to the car. The child walked willingly, not a flicker of concern or fear on her face. Chapter 6. 10th of May 2019, 9:30 a.m. Gloucester Police Station. Interview with Hattie Willoughby. "Did I like her straight away? Of course I did. I'm that sort of person. Wear my heart on my sleeve. Always looking for the good in people. She was so pretty and down to earth. I thought she was exactly what this village needed. But I sensed right from the start, literally the second Miranda walked through my back door on that evening, that she had her heckles up. I felt the tension all night. Bless her. Poor Miranda tried to conceal her jealousy, but she just couldn't manage it. She and Evie had become good friends really quickly. I mean, we all warmed to Miranda so much when she moved here from Chelsea. I'm a mum, a wife, I'm part of the PTA. I have a lot on. There is no way I would have had the time or the inclination to do what Miranda was doing. Of course, now we know. I can see it all for what it is. But no, I wouldn't have thought it, not in a million years. And believe me, I've seen a lot in my time. That something so shocking was going on right under our noses. I just wish we hadn't sat on the sidelines and watched it all happen. I wish I could turn back the clock and have been a better friend. But that's the joy of hindsight, isn't it?
Chapter 7. I had barely eaten any of the dinner at Hattie's last night that she had so lovingly prepared. It had been a thick, hearty meal, a beef stew with creamy mash and green beans. I had lots of green beans, but only a little meat and a mouthful of mash, because every time I tried to swallow, it felt as though the food was stuck in the back of my throat because, as I ate, my gaze kept falling on Verity. She said very little throughout the meal, and when she did speak, she used just a few words. I was on edge as I sat there in Hattie's kitchen. Everything before had felt so settled, yet within the space of a day it had become messy. If this Verity was to become a permanent fixture in the village, would I be willing to share Evie with her? I kept imagining scenarios of confrontation with Evie about my true feelings for Verity. I was preempting the future. I didn't want to feel that way. I just needed to know that everything was going to be as it was between Evie and me, that nothing would change. I had never been very good at competing. I was a very sore loser. Was it so selfish of me just to want Evie to myself? Things always get so complicated when women's friendship groups begin to grow. Meetings would start off with just 2, then slowly but surely someone would introduce a friend to the group, all perfectly innocent, of course. "Oh, I'm bringing my friend Sally on Saturday. You don't mind, do you?" Then, before you know it, Sally's brought her yoga chum along too. Then she's brought her sister. Soon enough, what was once a small, secure and civilized gathering is now overflowing with women who have very little in common. I felt I'd done so well up until now, making friends with Evie and the other girls. Everything felt right and simple. I knew that my past mistakes wouldn't be exposed with these girls. I was safe. So why did I feel so on edge around Verity, as though she might be the one to suddenly upset the apple cart? I'd tried to envisage Evie, Verity and I as a threesome, but even that didn't sit right with me. Had I sensed something about Verity that I didn't like? I was too afraid to admit it to myself. If there was any hint of a negative thought, I needed to push it away before it carried me away. This world I had built here for David, Annabelle and me was because of what I had made happen before. I'd already had my second chance. There certainly wouldn't be a third one. So instead of relaxing at book club last night with the small select few, I found I kept watching Evie to see how she responded to Verity, to see if her eyes lit up with interest at anything she said, which was very little. I tried to hang around at the end to subtly quiz Evie, but she said she had to dash off for the babysitter. Verity had already left half an hour before her, having said she was tired and needed an early night. I couldn't even enjoy the fact that, in the end, as it turned out, everyone loved my book choice and raved about it. I was too exasperated by this new woman in Hattie's kitchen. Suddenly, 7, which I had once considered lucky, now seemed such an ugly number. After a terrible night's sleep, I found it difficult to get going the next day. I'd woken with a headache and groaned at what sort of day I knew lay ahead. Annabelle and I hurried through the school gates just as the bell sounded, which is the closest I've ever come to getting Annabelle to school late, and I cursed Verity's untimely appearance last night, holding her entirely responsible for the pounding raging through my temples. I bent down and pulled Annabelle into an embrace, to make up for how short I'd been with her in the last 30 minutes. I'd all but yanked her hair into 2 bunches, and not the usual elaborate plaited affair I prided myself on achieving every day. I released her from my embrace, gave one bunch a light tug, and kissed her button nose. "I love you, Annabella Boo." At just 8, she was on the cusp of being aware of what her peers thought of her, and so she looked around to check no one had seen before she kissed me plaintively on the lips. I watched her wander slowly to the next gate, where her teacher was waiting to greet her. I always called her Miss Honey, as she reminded me of the character from Matilda, but her name was actually Miss Mead. Annabelle took one last glance back before she walked into school. I stood for a moment, my hand shading the sun from my eyes. The warmth on my face was soothing, and I wanted to stay there for a while, allowing it to do its healing work and cure me of this headache. But my mind had already begun to flood with the jobs I needed to complete before the weekend so David and I could relax. Sabrina, my cleaner, was just arriving as we were racing out of the house, and I took a moment to feel the relief and the knowledge that if nothing else got done today, I will at least have a tidy house. The candle business I started last year was going from strength to strength. More retailers were taking bulk orders, and today I had 2 conference calls, one with the supplier of the essences and one with a distributor. Nothing really happened on a Friday, and it was unusual for me to be so busy. I was usually well and truly wound down by Thursday evening, but not today. Today my stomach was in knots. I felt out of sorts. Little pelts of negative energy forced their way in, and I was using every bit of strength I had to fight them off. It was an old, familiar feeling I thought I'd seen the back of. I always thought moving here would mean I wouldn't have to feel like that again. I would never have to become that person again. I looked off to the right of the playground, where a couple of groups of mothers were still gathered, taking a few minutes to catch up on the local gossip. It was then that I spotted her. Verity. She was wearing a running vest and shorts. She had appeared to have been a slight woman last night, but she was now revealing firm, toned legs and muscly arms. She was standing next to Evie and Hattie. I immediately began walking over. My heart began to pound. Would I be able to pull off the same act as I had last night and engage in casual conversation with Verity? "Morning," I said in the happiest voice I could muster. All 3 women turned and chorused their hellos. "I see you found out where we all gather on a weekday morning," I said to Verity, trying to maintain a tone of humour. She looked at me blankly, then raised her head in acknowledgement of my poor attempt at a joke. Evie and I leant in for a quick hug. "Oh yes, Mother's Club." Verity did quotation marks with her hands. Was she trying to be smart? So why was she here, making herself part of a clan she clearly thought was some sort of a joke? I felt the anger burn in the pit of my stomach. Had Evie noted Verity's remark? "But you don't have kids." This had been established last night, but the words were out of my mouth before I could stop them. Evie glanced at me. Why else would she be here at the school gates? I wanted to add, but her expression was twisted and anxious, as though I had clearly stepped over some invisible line. No, Verity said, and looked down at her trainers. Had I touched on a sore subject? Thinking again, when the topic had been mentioned last night, it had been brushed over quickly, by Evie if I remember rightly. Messy divorce? Fertility issues? I had definitely made Verity feel awkward, and I definitely felt bad for that. Having kids wasn't for everyone. I mean, I only had one myself and surprised myself daily that I'd achieved that. I'd left it very late into my 30s, and I got used to a life of just David and I. I found it hard when a screaming ball of pink and purple slipped into our world and turned it upside down. It's Verity's first day writing her book. I bumped into her on the corner. We got to chatting and, found ourselves here, Evie said hurriedly. We always said a coffee shop is what this village needs, I said to Verity. I mean, there are enough of us who would use it. All this standing round on corners, so uncouth. I did the last bit in the voice that made me sound posher than I was, and Evie laughed. And I suddenly felt that pull between us, that magnetic force that had brought us together in the first place. Fancy popping in for one? I said, just to Evie. Verity in her running get-up was ready for a marathon by the looks of things, and I didn't feel bad for not extending the invitation to her. Love to. Evie smiled, and a swell of happiness erupted. There was something about being in Evie's company that made me feel she would always have my back, no matter what. Evie was the saviour that I needed after the misdemeanour that had cost me so many friends and nearly my marriage. She showed me how a friendship could be easy, that you didn't need 150k followers on Instagram to feel special. Just one good friend was all you needed.